Okay, everyone, welcome back to Chapter 14 of our Biology 1010 lecture series over speciation and extinction. So this lecture is going to talk a lot about evolution, how different forms of evolution impact different species, how different species arise, how biologists determine what a different species is, and some of the traits and characteristics that are used to determine one species from one another. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So first off, we need to define what a species is. So in evolution, new species form while other species become extinct all the time. Throughout history, there have been countless species that have arisen and evolved and gone extinct throughout the fossil record. It's estimated that about 99.9% of all animal species that have ever existed have gone extinct, and they're no longer around for us to see. But these distinct groups of organisms that you can look at in nature, you can tell that these birds all look the same, these trees all look the same, these bacteria all look the same. And that's kind of what we might call a species. Well, that definition of species has changed over time. As scientists have learned more about DNA, more about evolution, and things like that, the definition of what a true species is has changed over time. Now, how do these species occur? How do new species arise? What are some of the forces that cause these new species to arise? Well, evolution is one of them. And there's two forms of evolution. Now, they're really the same thing. It's just two ways to explain the same phenomenon: microevolution and macroevolution. Now, microevolution, I'm going to use the analogy of a checkerboard. You take the checkerboard and you've got all the black pieces on one side and all the red on the other. And you move one piece of the checkerboard. Now, this is one animal over here, and one animal over here is going to be represented by our black checkers and our red checkers. You move one piece on the black checker, and that's a small microevolutionary change. Very small, tiny little change where this bird may have a small little evolutionary pressure to select for a more orange-colored head. And that's it. Very something simple. Now, our red checker has the same thing. One move, one small little thing where this bacteria may have a small pressure to become more rounded, or something instead of more rod-shaped. So those are small microevolutionary changes, little small changes that are not really noticeable. Well, you play a couple more games of chess, or of checkers, a couple more checker moves, and eventually what's going to happen is those black checkers are going to be in a completely different place than they started out at, and the red checkers are going to be in a completely different place. And that whole checkerboard is going to look completely different than it did to start with. Well, all of those individual small little microevolutionary changes add up on top of themselves to lead to macroevolution, which is a large-scale change from species to species. You can see microevolution once those checkerboards start to move. But it takes a little while. 3 or 4 pieces of the checkers that move, you can start to see a change. That checkerboard doesn't look like it did originally. But as the game continues and more checkers are moved and more checkers are removed from the board or added or whatever, the game is going to look drastically different than it did to start with. Although they are still checkers and it is still a checkerboard, the game or the species that you started with is going to look drastically different than it did to start with. You really can't tell the difference between microevolution and macroevolution on an evolutionary scale. This is just small scale changes within a species where one species has a small little change to become a little more orange, a little more brown, a little more black, or something like that, a little more slightly longer wings, a little more longer tail, or something like that. And all of those changes add up to one another until you have a totally different looking bird that can no longer interbreed with the bird that it came from. So macroevolution and microevolution, the difference between them: small scale change, large scale change, but you really can't find a defining point between where these two things occur. You can't pick a point on that checkerboard and go, that's where that checker game became a different checker game. You can't do it. The first time you move is a small scale change, that's a different checkerboard. But you can't define when it became a different checkerboard. So microevolution, macroevolution are the exact same thing. They both add, this one adds up to this one. They compound on top of one another to add up to a macroevolutionary event. So they are both the same thing, both different ways to explain evolutionary events. Well, way back in the 1700s, a guy named Carolus Linnaeus started looking at animals around him and noticed all of these different species and different looks and different ways that animals behaved. And he started figuring out ways to classify these animals based on how he thought they were related to one another. Now, the way he did this was defining a way to name species using something called the Linnaean classification system, or binomial nomenclature. And what this did is he gave each animal, each species, a distinct species name, a way to define them. And what that does is it allows you to say this is a distinct species that is separate from this one. And this species has a similar relationship with this species above it. And this would be like sharing a last name. So you're not your mother or your father, but you are related to them. So you share a name in common, but you have a different first name. And this is kind of what he did there. He grouped them by last names, different first names. He grouped them by family names, who was related to who, and things like that. He did this all based on what they looked like. So it's not necessarily the most accurate thing on the planet, but he did a really great job given the fact that he was in the 1700s and he did not have DNA technology and things like that. He did this solely based on how they looked and how they behaved. Now, modern day biologists use different ways to classify species based on how they look and how they behave and things like that. We use something called the biological species concept. Species concepts are how biologists define what a new species is, or what one species is from another. How we define if a species is truly a separate species from a different animal, or if they are the same species. The way that we do this, there are lots of different species concepts, but the most common one is the biological species concept. And this is going to look at if two species can interbreed with one another, if their offspring comes out fertile and is also able to have babies. Those two species are the same species. The mother and the father are the same if the baby is able to have fertile offspring. If those two organisms interbreed, they may not have a baby. Or if they do have a baby, that baby may not be able to have offspring itself. And then in that case, they are two separate species. Their offspring that these two organisms will result from, their pairing, has to be able to reproduce. And that is the definition of the biological species concept. If you can produce fertile offspring, you are the same species. If you cannot, you are a separate species. And that's the biological species concept. Now, there are some problems with the biological species concept. If you reproduce asexually, things like bacteria, some species of sponges and things like that, you technically have not interbred with anything, so you're really not reproducing or technically even a species by the biological species concept, because you have to produce fertile offspring with mating with a different organism, and you haven't done that. You've reproduced with yourself, so that does not apply here. And the other problem here is that species that we only have representative by fossils, we can't truly say that that is a separate species or not from other species that look similar to it in the fossil record. We cannot interbreed a T-Rex with another very similar looking species of dinosaur to prove that they really are two separate species of dinosaurs and not just two different looking T-Rexes. So that's sort of a little bit of a problem too. The other problem that you run into with this one is that sometimes animals can interbreed in captivity that would never naturally interbreed in nature. This would be something like a liger, a half lion, half tiger. Those two organisms very rarely interbreed with one another. In nature, they very rarely interact with one another. So the fact that they would be coming in contact with a zoo is not a normal circumstance, not a normal thing. So if they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring in a zoo environment, that's not going to be a really great example of speciation, because they can interbreed, but they don't ever do that in nature. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be explained, and we'll talk about different types of reproductive barriers and how these different species form and things in just a second. So DNA analysis is really used today to help define what two different species are. So they'll run a DNA scan, a sequencing scan, and figure out what the DNA of an organism is. And then they will compare it with all the rest of the organisms that have also been scanned. And if two organisms, or if you suspect that two organisms are the same species or different species, you'll run their DNA. And then you'll check that sequence. And if they share 97% of their DNA in common, they are considered the same species. That means you share most of the genes, that means you share most of the proteins, that means you're pretty much going to be the exact same organism. And that's how that works. So you are the same species of an organism if you share 97% of your DNA in common with them. So how do new species form? How do we start with one species of organism and get two species or more from it? So there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but it all starts out when you have one large population of organisms that are all the same. So we'll start off with these butterflies right here. They're all the same. And then for some reason, one little group of these butterflies is going to leave the area that it's in and move to a different area. Now when that happens, that butterfly, it's going to reduce the gene pool available. There are no longer going to be these original butterflies available to breed with the entire population. They've left, they've gone somewhere else. And now they're going to be interbreeding with themselves in a different area with their own gene pool, and they have different evolutionary pressures to adapt to. The environment might be different over here. So they're going to have to adapt differently. Now, when that occurs, these organisms are going to undergo different evolutionary changes because they have a different gene pool than the original population and a different environment to adapt to. These original organisms now have lost part of their gene pool, so they now have a more limited gene pool to reproduce with. So that's how this works. Once a small population leaves the original population and goes somewhere else, they're going to have to start interbreeding with their own population under different evolutionary pressures, which is going to eventually lead to new species forming. Now, how do new species occur because of this? Well, eventually what's going to happen is when two species separate, eventually when all of those species have to interbreed with themselves in their new area, and evolution's going to say, hey, it's colder over here, you need to grow more fur. It's a little more bright, you need to become a darker color so you can blend in. Various other changes that are going to be pushed upon this animal via evolution. Its genes are going to change so much that it will not be able to interbreed with one of those, with the original population that it came from. So once that occurs, these organisms are considered separate species. So when that occurs, you are talking about something called a reproductive barrier, something that keeps two separate species apart from one another, something that prevents them from having babies. So if organisms encounter reproductive barriers, they are considered two separate species. They are not able to produce fertile reproductive offspring. Now, if they can produce fertile reproductive offspring and they do not encounter any reproductive barriers, they are the same species. If they mate with one another, they encounter a reproductive barrier along the way. We'll talk about what these reproductive barriers are. They do not produce a fertile offspring. They are considered two separate species, and this is how these reproductive barriers work. So there's lots of different types of reproductive barriers, and we'll talk about how each one of them leads to different types of evolution in just a second. So the very first type of reproductive barrier is something termed a pre-zygotic reproductive barrier. Pre meaning before, zygotic meaning zygote, pre-fertilization. So before the zygote is even fertilized, before egg and sperm unite. So the very first one is you're going to start out with two separate species of organisms, or one separate species of organisms that's in a large environment or something like that, a big field. Now, how this one works, the very first one is going to be considered habitat isolation. This is going to be the most simplistic pre-zygotic reproductive barrier. Two organisms are found in two totally separate environments. This thistle here and blueberry plants over here, you can see these two plants. This ladybug is going to feed on both of them. The ladybug is going to travel between the thistle here and the blueberry, but the chances of the blueberry and the thistle ever coming in contact with one another to ever reproduce, to ever come in contact to have offspring are pretty much zero. So the chances of these two plants ever coming in contact with one another is never, ever, ever going to happen here. So another example would be these two ladybugs. Different species of ladybugs are different versions of ladybugs. This species feeds on blueberries. This species feeds on thistles. These two species of ladybugs will never ever come in contact with one another. Now, in theory, they might be able to reproduce and form fertile offspring, but they will never interact with one another. They will never eat on the same plant. They will never talk to one another, so they will never produce fertile offspring because they don't see each other. So that's habitat isolation. This is how two species maintain separate species because they just don't come in contact with one another. You can also have temporal isolation, and this is when organisms come out at different times of the day or at different seasons, or they mate at different times of the year. This field cricket over here, you can see, this version matures in the spring, whereas other versions of field crickets may mature in the fall. If you mature in the spring, these field crickets that are mating in the spring are going to be the only ones that you have to mate with. And you can't mate with field crickets that aren't mature yet. You'll be dead by then. And then the ones in the fall are going to die over the winter and not be able to mate with the spring crickets. So eventually what's going to happen is that they may be able to interbreed with one another. They might be the same species of crickets to start with, but eventually what's going to happen is after hundreds and hundreds of generations of this change right here, breeding just during the spring and just during the fall, they're going to adapt differently to one another's environments, and they will evolve into two separate species at some point in time. Now, this implies temporal isolation. An organism is in the same environment with one another. They have the ability to come in contact with one another. They just maybe reproduce at different times of the season, or they're out during different times of the day and things like that. So they're in the same environment, they just don't talk to one another. Now the next one is going to be behavioral isolation. And this is when you have two different species of organisms that are active during the same time of day, they reproduce during the same season, and they're found in the same habitat. But they don't sing the right song, they don't dance the right dance. They're just not what the male or female of the species is looking for. So there's lots of frogs in the same pond, but leopard frogs sing a different song than bullfrogs like to listen to. So the bullfrog's not going to be attracted to the leopard frog singing. It's just not going to pay any attention to it. It's in the right habitat and reproducing at the same time in the same habitat. It just doesn't like the song that frog is singing. Now the next one is going to be mechanical isolation. And this is going to occur when the organisms don't line up for mating. The genitals don't line up. This would be like the concept of a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Now they're the same species of dog, but you kind of get the idea. Or they use a different type of pollinator. The particular plant uses a honeybee, whereas another type of plant uses a fly. So you're in the same area, you reproduce at the same time, you sing the right songs, you use the same time of day to reproduce, you're in the same habitat, but you can't come in contact with your reproduction because your pollinator is not going to come in contact with each other, or you just can't mate because your reproductive organs just don't line up with one another. Now the next one is going to be gametic isolation. And this one occurs when organisms are in the same environment, they're gametes can line up, or their genitals can line up with one another. They could even maybe sing the right song. They reproduce during the same time of day. They're in the same habitat. Their sperm and egg have access to one another, but they don't occur. They don't allow for fertilization to occur when they unite. The sperm and the egg, they come in contact with one another. They don't speak the same language. The egg does not recognize the sperm does not recognize the egg, and they just do not unite. So they're in the same environment. They've got the same type of reproductive organs. They sing the right songs. They're in the right reproductive cycles. They're in the right environment, but their sperm and their eggs just don't talk to one another. And this could be caused due to different chromosomal numbers, different proteins, lots of different things can cause this type of thing to occur. Our example here is two different species of starfish, or of sea urchins, and they reproduce by casting their sperm and eggs into the water. The sperm and the eggs can easily come in contact with one another, but they just don't fertilize each other's eggs or for the other species, and that's just how that works. So for pre-zygotic barriers, if an organism is in the same area, reproduces at the same time of day, sings the right song, their genitals line up correctly, and their gametes unite correctly, they're more than likely going to be able to be the same species, but not always. So, if you're the same species, you have obviously overcome all of these barriers. If you're a separate species, one of these is probably going to keep you separate because you just don't reproduce at the same time of day. You're not attracted to different species and things like that. Now, what happens if animals can overcome these and they can unite their genitals? Their eggs can and gametes can unite and fertilize the egg, but sometimes you can still have reproductive barriers to occur. And those are called post-zygotic reproductive barriers. And this is going to occur after the baby has been fertilized, after the zygote has been fertilized. The first one is going to be hybrid inviability. So you've produced offspring, but what might happen is the offspring might not be viable. So you've produced babies. The babies may have different chromosome numbers because you're originally a different species. So you have 42 chromosomes and your partner has 46. Those tend to not work very well. So what happens is any offspring that is going to start to develop via that fertilization concept is not going to be able to develop and successfully be born. So in our case here, we have plant seeds. The plants have united. Different species of eucalyptus. The hybrid seeds of eucalyptus, if you were to ever plant them, they just would not develop into a tree. So the babies are not going to ever develop correctly. They will not reach being able to be birthed, and that's a big problem. You can produce babies, but the babies don't ever grow to maturity. They don't ever grow to be birthed, so that's a problem. The next one can occur if your babies, you do birth a baby, but the baby is sterile. And that's a big deal. We want offspring that are able to reproduce, and that's the whole point of evolution, to be able to pass on your genes. If you've wasted all this energy and all this time to produce an offspring that can't reproduce, that's evolutionarily really expensive and really wasteful for you as a species. So this is not a good thing. So what occurs here is the concept of a mule or a liger. A lion and a tiger, a horse and a donkey. They have different chromosome numbers. It results in offspring which are sterile. They cannot reproduce or have offspring of themselves. And the last one is going to be hybrid breakdown. So you do have babies. Your baby may be fertile, but your baby may be very sick. It may not be very fertile. It may have a very hard time carrying pregnancies or getting other females pregnant. It may have mutated genitalia. It may just not be a very functional. It may be fertile, but it may not be a very functional adult organism. So that's not very useful for you from an evolutionary perspective either. So these are some ways that organisms can keep each other separate species, even though they can mate with one another. Now, if you're in the right area, you sing the right song, you reproduce at the right time of day, your genitalia can line up, your sperm and egg can unite, your seeds are viable, your offspring are fertile, and they do not break down, you are the same species. You have a baby that is fully functional, that reproduces, that does not break down, you are the same species. And this is how this works. Reproductive barriers. Now, reproductive barriers can also arise from physical separation in the environment, not just technically from animals and living in different habitats or things like that. Sometimes organisms can be separated in their habitat based on where they live or environmental conditions. Things like mountain ranges or rivers or deserts can separate organisms from one another. It's hard to get over a mountain if you're a plant. If you can't go through the desert without any water, obviously you're not going to be able to get to the other species on the other side to mate with them. So environmental and physical separation is also a thing that can drive speciation. Well, the very first type of speciation that's driven by environmental conditions is called allopatric speciation. An allopatric speciation occurs when an original population, there was more than likely at one point in time, in this big field here, a population of yellow and purple plants that thrived all throughout this valley here. A mountain range arose at some point in time, probably through some sort of earthquake or a glacier receding or something, that separated these two populations of plants. The yellow plants on one side, the purple on the other, that eventually occurred. But what happened in the original was the yellow plants over here and the purple plants that were all spread out were separated. Over here you had a mix of yellow and purple, and over here you had a mix of yellow and purple. Now what happened is over here the conditions on this side of the mountain are different than they are on this side of the mountain. Yellow, the plant was the color, happened to have allowed this plant to survive better on this side of the mountain than purple, and yellow eventually became the dominant color. Purple on this side was the other way around. Purple happened to have allowed this plant to survive better, and that's happened to have been what was selected for. So the yellow plants died off. They weren't allowed to survive. Their genes were eventually lost, and all you were left with was purple plants. And the same thing over here. The purple plants, they were eventually died off throughout the population, and all you were left with was yellow plants to reproduce with. So eventually what happens after a very, very, very long time, these two plant species, or these two plant populations, have no contact with one another. They evolve totally differently than one another because they can't come in contact with one another. Their gene pools are separate. They've both encountered different evolutionary pressures, so they evolve differently than one another. And eventually this leads to this species and this species becoming distinctly different on a genetic level, which is going to cause them to no longer be able to reproduce with one another. And this is allopatric speciation, splitting up species with some sort of physical barrier in between them. Islands are another great example of allopatric speciation. You start out with one population of things on a big island, so tortoises in this case. These are the Galapagos tortoise that Charles Darwin writes about. You have the big island of the Galapagos here, the main island. Large turtles were found on this island. Eventually what happens is turtles can float on the ocean. Storms can blow them across. They can get caught on rafts and things like that of sea debris, driftwood and things, and carried with them. Animals can carry them, birds can carry them. What more than likely happened is all these islands were connected at one point in time, so one big species of tortoise migrated across from the mainland to one of the islands and eventually broke away. Well, anyway, all the population of tortoises on the big island are pretty much the same, but all the different little islands all have tortoises on them. They're all tortoises, but they're slightly different than the tortoises on all the other islands. And the reason for that is the different conditions on each one of these islands caused the different tortoises that were found on that island to evolve differently. Now, they all arose from the main population of tortoises, but eventually they broke away. Some sort of physical separation occurred, and those tortoises were now exposed to different evolutionary pressures, They evolved separately until eventually they were no longer to reproduce with this tortoises on the rest of the islands. This is another version of allopatric speciation. Isolated springs and underground rivers and things like that can also lead to allopatric speciation. So caves and things are great examples of this, especially in the southwestern United States. These little devil's hole fish, they're called pupfish. At one point in time, they're found in these little caves and hot springs and things. At one point in time, all these little springs were connected by underground rivers. So all these fish had the ability to come in contact with one another, different populations of fish they could come in contact with. As the fish became separate, the underground passageways either were drying up or humans dammed them up or things like that. They were no longer able to come in contact with different fish in the little populations of streams nearby. Now, at one point in time, they could reproduce with one another, but now they can't get out of their original springs, so they have started to evolve separately in their own hot springs now. And they can no longer mate with this fish nearby them, even though at one point in time they were the same species. Now, another form of speciation occurs when organisms are not separated by a physical barrier, some sort of physical separation, but they still evolve separately. Now, this is called sympatric speciation. And this occurs within a shared habitat. One organism will eventually speciate into two. Now, this can occur for various reasons, lots and lots of different reasons. But for one, the most easy way to explain this, for this example with plants, is the soil differences or the light differences. Now, I mentioned earlier our original population of plants was probably purple and yellow. Well, all throughout the different populations, there's going to be different soil concentrations, different amounts of light that come through the canopy. Maybe the mountains block some rain and things like that. So different environmental conditions will be found all throughout this habitat for these plants. Now, what's eventually going to occur is the habitat differences are going to lead to differences in the way that the plants look and the way that they reproduce. Now, they are able to come in contact with one another, but since they live in different little tiny microenvironments throughout their habitat, they're going to cause the plants to look differently, which eventually causes their genetics differences to accumulate, which causes speciation to occur. The yellow can no longer interbreed with the purple, even though they're literally right next to them, because the environment that they grow in is so different that if a yellow flower was to land in the purple, it would die. It would not be able to grow there. Another example is found in fish in Lake Elgin. Lots of fish in Africa do this, a lot of cichlid species. And this occurs when you have one original cichlid species in a pond or a lake, and all throughout this lake there are different environments. It's deeper in parts of the lake, more shallow in different parts of the lake, more foliage coverage in one part of the lake. It's warmer in one spot because it's more shallow, or colder in deeper spots and things like that. Well, these different environments all throughout the lake are going to attract different types of fish. Now, the original fish are going to seek out these different environments because as they age, they're going to want to be less visible in the deeper water. As they swim up, they're going to have to be more visible if they come to the surface, so they're going to want to swim down to be less visible. The smaller fish tend to hang near the surface, so the big fish will come up and hunt them. So different types of environmental conditions. So as the fish start to grow, they will spread out throughout this lake and encounter those different environmental conditions. Well, as they encounter these different environmental conditions, the populations will start to evolve separately in those new environmental conditions that they found. So the original population of fish will migrate out through the lake, find all these different little tiny habitats, and start to evolve differently inside of that lake, eventually leading to populations of fish that even though they're capable of interacting with one another, they don't interbreed with one another, and even if they did, they would not be able to produce fertile offspring. Now, this type of speciation often occurs a lot in plants. It's called sympatric speciation. In plants, the same. But polyploidy is another thing that can cause this in plants. Now, polyploidy are multi versions of chromosomes, extra chromosomes, occurs in plants because sometimes they have weird things that occur when their chromosomes mutate or when their chromosomes divide. So you can see different types of plants have different size chromosomes. Now, you have the same number of chromosomes, but they're different sizes. Different species of plants, but when you breed them together, you get a weird version of a plant that when it multiplies or we try to cultivate it, it doubles itself and triples itself and ends up with way too many chromosomes. It can't reproduce by itself, but it produces the best of both worlds for plants. You get lots of cotton without a lot of leaves, kind of thing. Whereas this one has a lot of cotton and a lot of leaves, and this one has not a lot of leaves but not a lot of cotton. So you get the best of both worlds, kind of thing. But this type of organism in a plant world cannot survive without our intervention. We help this type of plant to survive. So it's very difficult sometimes to figure out which type of speciation you're looking at. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's very difficult, and sometimes you can't even tell at all which type of barrier that you're looking at. Nature is a continuum. Sometimes it looks like a sympatric speciation event has occurred, sometimes it looks like an allopatric speciation event has occurred. Those are very obvious, but sometimes it looks like both have occurred, and sometimes that could be a blend of both that really did occur. It's very difficult to determine sometimes for different species. And just because one species evolved via allopatric speciation, a very similar species to it doesn't have to evolve via allopatric speciation either. So evolution supports two different records, two different forms of speciation on two different paces, I should say, how fast it occurs. One of them is going to be called gradualism, the other one is punctuated equilibrium. So gradualism occurs with a very slow transition, very incremental, very easily recordable change throughout the fossil record. Now for protists that live in the ocean, we have these types of change. We can watch the very ancestral protist evolve. We can see each step along the way as it evolved and became more complex throughout the fossil record. And this is gradualism. You can see the small little changes along the way where one species became another. The little steps add up on itself. They all become one step, and you add up until you become something different. Very easy to see on this one. Another pace of evolution is called punctuated equilibrium. This is going to occur when very rapid evolutionary changes occur. You either survive or you don't, kind of thing, followed by very rapid or very long periods of stability, I should say. Not a lot of change, where species rapidly jump from one species to the next, not a lot of time in the middle, and they stay that way for a very long time. So punctuated equilibrium is reflected best in allopatric speciation. You see some sort of drastic event like a volcanic eruption which lays down a layer of lava that plants can't cross, or burns through a forest or something like that. Or an earthquake which raises a mountain range or drops a flood down in the middle, or causes a canyon to occur, things like that. That's going to be a punctuated equilibrium event where species are drastically, very quickly separated apart from one another, and you have to adapt very quickly to your new environment, or you will go extinct, and that's how that one works. A very quick, rapid evolution, and then what happens is there's not going to be a volcanic eruption for quite a while. More than likely, there's not going to be another flood for quite a while. So once those species have evolved very quickly to fit their new environment, that environment tends to stay stable for a very long time. So you won't see a lot of change in organisms that are evolving via punctuated equilibrium. Speciation can also occur very quickly after a mass extinction event. There have been 5 mass extinction events throughout the history of the Earth. And if you think about it, what happens is you have large amounts of animals that are eating food, occupying space, and then all of a sudden there's not. There's way less animals that are occupying that same space, that are eating the same environment resources, sharing the environment. So whatever little organisms are left over now have a brand new environment open to them that they may not have had open to them before. And this is how mammals started to arise. At one point in time, dinosaurs were the dominant organisms on the planet. They went extinct. Mammals, which were the small, little, tiny cave-dwelling animals that were being oppressed and crushed by the dinosaurs, the non-avian dinosaurs, the lizards, reptiles. Now, all the reptiles are gone. The mammals are the only thing left. So now the mammals can venture out of their caves, out of their little burrows, into the large environment where the reptiles once lived, and now the mammals can take over that previously occupied habitat. So extinction events can also lead to speciation events. Extinction is the end of a species. It's pretty easy to determine when species are extinct, when you no longer see them in the fossil record, or they no longer are able to reproduce viable offspring. So like I mentioned, there have been 5 mass extinction events throughout the Earth's history in the last 600 million years due to major environmental changes, ends of ice age, going to be meteor strikes. We can see the layer of meteor right there across throughout the Earth, where all the sands from the meteor were tossed up and where they landed on Earth and were crushed into rock layers. You can see that across the Earth. So we can determine when mass extinction events occurred and when different species and different types of organisms started to evolve after those mass extinction events. Now, another way that mass extinction events can occur, not just because of things like meteor strikes of diseases, are plate tectonics, the movement of the Earth. So as you know, Pangaea, at one point in time, the massive supercontinent, started to break apart. And once it broke apart, the shorelines of these continents, these major land masses, started to change. Deserts started to form. Where once were oceans were now deserts, where once were deserts now have oceans. Once were forests are now grasslands, where once grasslands are now forest. So as that drastic change of the environment occurred and the continents rearranged themselves, organisms and animals and things had to adapt to these new changing environments. The sad reality is the vast majority of them couldn't, and they went extinct. So this is another way to explain mass extinctions, the movement of the planet, which causes the ending of ice ages, causing deserts to form and things like that. And species just aren't able to keep up. Now, how do we classify all the species on Earth, and how do we figure out who they're related to one another? Well, the most common way to do this is looking at the Linnaean classification system over here, how we classify them based on how they're related. The domain, kingdom, phylum, class, genus, species concept. Danish kings play cards on fat green stools, if you wanted the easy way to remember that. So how this works is it starts out with the most inclusive and goes down to the least inclusive. So the most at the top and the least at the bottom. So we're talking about this plant here, aloe vera. You're probably very familiar with this plant. Well, this is a eukaryotic plant. So every single cell on the planet that's eukaryotic is going to be in the same domain as that, several million species. It's going to be a plant. Well, kingdom Plantae, we are not plants, so we're not going to be in there. Kingdom Bacteria, things like that, kingdom Archaea, we're not going to be in there. So there are only about 375,000 different species of plants, so that narrows it down a little bit. You can narrow it down by the phylum, Anthophyta, green flowering plants. Things like that narrows it down. Liliopsida, lilies. You can narrow it down again. Liliaes, the only lilies, true lilies, 1,200 species. The different family of lilies narrows it down again. The genus Aloe, which tells you it's going to look very similar to this. There's only 500 different species of aloe. And then you get down to the most inclusive, which is aloe vera. The only species that looks like this is the only species that can reproduce with aloe vera is aloe vera. So how this works is the more species you share in common with the ones above you, the more you are related to them. So if you share the same name, aloe vera, aloe martinsin, aloe figueres, all the rest of those would be related to aloe vera, but they are not the same species. And we know that because, once again, this would be like saying Steve Jones and then his father Adam Jones and his mother Alexa Jones. They're not Steve Jones, but they are related to Steve Jones, and they share the same last name. And this is the same last name concept as genus. Species is the first name, genus is the last name. That's how you know you're related to one another, kind of thing. So here you go on that one. You can walk through this one again. I just talked about how this one works. Now, unfortunately, modern-day taxonomy does not really reflect evolutionary relationships. It just shows who's kind of in the same relationship to who. But it does not, in the same groups, the same orders. It does not, however, truly reflect evolutionary relationships, who's really related to who. Now, if you really want to see who's related to who, you have to start talking about cladistics. And cladistics are going to allow us to put animals on a cladogram, which is what you see here. And this allows us to figure out when traits that are unique to each one of these groups of organisms evolved and which groups of organisms share it in common with them. So who's related to who, and when did that trait come into that particular family. Now this allows us to determine, like I mentioned, ancestral traits that all the groups and all the organisms in that group have, or derived traits, things that are unique to that group. Now all mammals are derived from the ancestral mammal, whatever that happened to have been, some small mouse-like organism. Now that small mouse-like organism had mammary glands, which means it produces milk, and it had hair. So every organism that evolved from that guy right there is going to be considered a mammal, which means they all have the ability to produce milk and grow hair. So that's considered an ancestral trait right there. Now, if you go over here, we have the platypus. The platypus lays eggs. It does not produce live young. The kangaroo and us, we produce live young. So we are distinctly different than the platypus. We had a branching event right there. We don't produce eggs. So down here, with the branch right there, is live birth on this side or eggs on that side. So we do produce live birth, as well do kangaroos. They are marsupials, however. So that is an ancestral trait, giving birth to live young instead of giving birth to eggs. Platypuses do not give birth to live young, so they are not going to have that ancestral trait. Kangaroos, their marsupial little babies, are born very, very, very prematurely. They are not attached to a placenta. However, human and other mammals like deer and dogs and things are going to have placental birth. So that placenta is going to be a derived characteristic. It's only found in placental mammals. All mammals do give birth, all mammals have mammary glands and hair, but not all mammals give birth to babies via a placental birth. So that is a derived characteristic that is unique to only placental mammals. Anything behind it is not going to be considered a derived characteristic. It's just an ancestral characteristic. Because this one's every mammal has these, but below it, this is just the highest one. Cladograms are very useful to help figure out how organisms are related to one another. You can look at the cladogram here. Move over a page. And this is going to consider a thing is called clades. So cladograms use clades. And what a clade is it's one organism and every single one of its common ancestors grouped together, all together, and that's a clade. So birds, and all of the birds' ancestors are going to be considered a clade. Now, if you take the bird, all of its ancestors are going to be considered non-avian dinosaurs, crocodiles, and if you take all those together, you've got a clade as well. Now, birds itself are also considered a clade, all of the ancestors of birds. All the ancestors of dinosaurs, which include birds, the things above them, are also going to be considered a clade. And crocodiles are their own clade. They don't share a common ancestor with birds. Birds don't share a common ancestor they don't share a recent ancestor, I should say. So they're a little distinctly different. They're not warm-blooded, and that's kind of a characteristical difference between these two. Now, physical similarities between these two guys do not derive because of evolution that are caused by just environmental conditions. Just the way they look, convergent evolution and things are not going to be focused on via cladistics. So if they just look the same, that's not a good way or a reason to toss them in an evolutionary clade. If you look like them, you might be related, but that's not a dead guarantee. So if you just look like it, that's not a guaranteed reason to group them together. So what you're looking at in a cladogram is a common ancestor here. These branching events, right here, indicate a common ancestor between birds and crocodiles. But at one point in time, crocodiles and birds had a common ancestor that had an evolutionary branching event. Crocodiles went down here. The ancestor to the ancestors to birds and dinosaurs continued to evolve on a separate path. It had a branching event which eventually led to dinosaurs as well as birds. Right there, two splits in its path as well. So, dinosaurs and reptiles, and birds, share a common ancestor, which makes them a clade. They're very closely related to one another. Crocodiles do not share a common ancestor with them. They do, which makes them a larger clade if you group them all together. This is kind of an odd little concept here, but these branching events indicate common ancestors, where an ancestor between the two, where a trait derived or a trait separated once occurred. So reptiles, lizards, and turtles are not going to be included in our clade here, and this is where that Linnaean process comes inside. If you're talking about the class Reptilia, it includes crocodiles, dinosaurs, lizards, and snakes, but it doesn't include birds. Birds are not Reptilia, they are Avia. They are not in the same class as reptiles, although technically they are in the same clade because they share a common ancestor with all of those organisms. And this is where things get weird here. So clades show evolutionary relationship. Linnaean classification does not. Another classification scheme that they use, like I mentioned, is birds are warm-blooded. Mammals are warm-blooded. They are not that closely related to one another. According to Linnaean classification, they could not have shared an endothermic, they would have shared a warm-blooded ancestor, but according to cladistics, they don't. So very odd on how this one works. Okay, guys, that's pretty much all I've got for this PowerPoint on how species arise in the environment, different types of speciation, different types of evolution. So if you have any questions at all on this one, please feel free to send me an email. If not, have a good rest of your day.